It all started with something trivial, something so small that at first I barely registered it. Elizabeth and I had been married for 10 years, and over time our life together had become predictable. Not in a bad way, mind you. Routine has its comforts. My days were filled with work, hers with her own activities, and evenings we shared a quiet, unremarkable rhythm. But a few weeks ago, something shifted. She seemed different. At first I thought little of it. People go through phases. Maybe this was just hers. But as the days passed, those changes became impossible to overlook. It all began one morning during one of our usual breakfasts when her newfound energy took on a name, Jenna. She said with a spark of excitement in her voice that I hadn't heard in a while. Apparently this Jenna had invited her to a party, and Elizabeth seemed eager to go. "Who's Jenna?" I asked, setting down my coffee cup. Her answer was casual, almost dismissive. "Oh, just someone I met at a charity event. She's incredible, so lively and fun." I didn't press the matter, though I found it odd. In 10 years of marriage, I had never heard her mention a Jenna. I stored the information away silently, noting the way her eyes lit up as she spoke. Over the next few days, Elizabeth's schedule became noticeably busier. There were dinners with friends, outings, and an uptick in social gatherings. She never used to care much for social life, which had been limited to a few close friends I knew well. But now there were new names, new events, and a new energy in her step. It wasn't lost on me, though I chose not to confront her about it. I've never been the type to jump to conclusions or let my mind spiral into paranoia. Still, I kept watching, taking mental notes of her behavior, the way she dressed, the way she seemed to spend more time getting ready before heading out. One evening, she emerged from our bedroom wearing a black dress I hadn't seen in years. It hugged her figure in a way that made her look stunning, no doubt, but it was far more elegant than what I would expect for a simple night out with friends. Her makeup was meticulous, her hair styled perfectly. I sat on the couch, flipping through documents for work, but my attention shifted entirely to her as she adjusted her earrings in the hallway mirror. "Don't wait up," she said with a glance in my direction, her tone light but firm. She smiled briefly before walking out the door, leaving the scent of her perfume lingering in the air. I didn't say a word. I simply watched her go. That night when she returned, something felt off. She didn't look tired like someone who had spent hours laughing and chatting with friends. Instead, she seemed composed, serene, almost as though she had just finished an important task rather than a social evening. She slipped off her heels by the door and headed straight to the bedroom without a word. I followed her movements with my eyes, noting the calm precision with which she moved. It was as if she were operating on autopilot. When she stepped into the shower, I couldn't help but notice her handbag sitting on the table by the door. It was a bag I'd seen countless times before, but tonight something caught my attention. Peeking out from the side pocket was a corner of a pink envelope. I stood there for a moment, debating with myself. I don't make a habit of snooping. It's not who I am. But something about that envelope felt out of place, like a piece of a puzzle that didn't belong. Against my better judgment, I reached for it and carefully pulled it out. Inside was a note written in a bold, masculine handwriting. "Thanks for the amazing evening. You and Jenna are the best." There was no signature, no context, just those words. My jaw tightened as I slipped the note back into the envelope and returned it to her bag, ensuring everything was exactly as I'd found it. I sat back down on the couch, my mind racing, but my expression blank. When she came out of the shower, wrapped in a towel, she seemed completely at ease. "How was your night?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Oh, it was wonderful," she replied lightly. Jenna really knows how to liven things up. I nodded, offering no further questions. If she had something to tell me, she would. If not, I would wait. Patience has always been one of my strengths, and I intended to use it now. The following day, I decided to approach things from a different angle. When Elizabeth mentioned she had plans with Jenna again, I casually suggested joining them. "Why don't I come along?" I said, keeping my tone light. "It's been a while since we've done anything fun together." Her reaction was immediate. For a brief moment, she froze, her smile faltering just enough for me to notice. Then she laughed, waving off the suggestion. "You wouldn't enjoy it," she said. "It's just going to be a bunch of girls talking about things you'd find boring. Trust me, you'd hate it. Her response was smooth, almost too smooth. I let it slide, not wanting to push the matter further, but her hesitation, however brief, didn't escape me. That evening, as I watched her get ready again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Her movements were deliberate, her energy electric, but there was an underlying tension in the way she avoided my gaze. When she finally left, I stayed seated on the couch, staring at the door long after it closed behind her. The house was quiet, but my thoughts weren't. I didn't know what the truth was, but one thing was clear. There was more to this situation than met the eye. And as I sat there alone in the stillness of our home, I found myself wondering where the line between truth and deceit truly lay. The next morning began with a distinct clarity of purpose. Over breakfast, I listened to Elizabeth talk about her workday plans, her tone as calm and carefree as ever. She looked unbothered, as though nothing unusual had happened the night before. But I barely registered her words. My mind was elsewhere, focused on unraveling the truth behind her increasingly erratic behavior. She finished her coffee, kissed me on the cheek, and left for work, her heels clicking confidently down the driveway. I sat at the kitchen table, watching her leave, knowing I couldn't afford to let this charade continue. That evening, as we sat down to dinner, I decided to test her. So I began casually. "How was your night? Did Jenna sort out whatever trouble she was in?" Elizabeth smiled, her expression as composed as always. "Oh, it wasn't anything serious," she replied lightly. "We ended up at a cafe, had a glass of wine, and talked it over. It's all fine now." Her response was smooth, almost rehearsed, and she even went so far as to pull out her phone to show me pictures from the evening. In the photos, she and Jenna were seated at a small table, smiling for the camera. A warm glow lit the background, making it seem like a relaxed evening in a cozy cafe. But something was off. One photo showed sunlight streaming through the window, far too bright for an evening shot. Another captured Jenna holding a coffee cup, not a wine glass, as Elizabeth had just described. These discrepancies were minor, the kind most people would overlook. But once I saw them, I couldn't unsee them. Her story was full of tiny cracks, and those cracks were all I needed to confirm my suspicions. Still, I didn't confront her. I smiled, nodded, and said, "Looks like you two had a nice time. Glad it wasn't anything serious." Inside, however, I was boiling. The lies were piling up, but I wasn't ready to call her out yet. Instead, I decided to push a little further to see how far she would go to maintain this facade. "Why don't we go out tonight?" I suggested later, keeping my tone casual. "Just the two of us. Dinner, a nice bottle of wine, something simple like old times." For a moment she hesitated. It was subtle, but her body language shifted. Then she smiled and said, "That sounds wonderful, but Jenna already made plans for us tonight. She wants me to meet some of her friends. It could be a good networking opportunity." Her reasoning was plausible, even logical, but I could tell she was deflecting. "I could come with you," I offered. "Might be nice to meet some new people." She laughed, shaking her head. "It's just a girls' night," she said. "You'd be bored out of your mind." Her tone was light, dismissive, and final. I didn't press the issue. I let her leave, but as soon as the door closed behind her, I grabbed my keys and followed her. Her destination was a familiar location, the upscale club in the city center. I parked a block away and watched from a distance. She didn't enter through the main doors this time either. Instead, she disappeared down the side alley and entered through a discreet black door. I stayed in the car, watching, waiting. The club appeared normal enough on the surface. Luxury cars pulling up to the valet, well-dressed patrons stepping out into the flashing lights and thumping bass of the music inside. But something about the place felt off. Couples arriving at the club didn't just look wealthy. They looked curated, like pieces of art meant to impress. Their interactions were intimate, bordering on suggestive. This wasn't just a nightclub. It was something else entirely. My suspicions deepened when I saw the security detail at the entrance. These men were sharp, alert, and unyielding. When I tried to approach the front door, I was stopped immediately. "Membership card?" the man asked, his tone curt. I feigned confusion, saying I must have left it at home, but he wasn't buying it. "No card, no entry," he said, waving me off like I was an inconvenience. Frustrated, I returned to my car and sat there. gripping the steering wheel as I tried to make sense of what I just witnessed. Minutes later, a black sedan pulled up, and out stepped two women and a man. Their laughter was loud and carefree as they made their way to the same black door Elizabeth had used. Their demeanor was intimate, their physical closeness undeniable. Whatever this place was, it catered to a specific kind of crowd, one I didn't like the thought of Elizabeth being part of. The pieces began to fall into place. I'd heard whispers about exclusive clubs like this, places where wealthy elites gathered for activities they wouldn't dare admit to in public. Swinger parties, partner swaps, secret rendezvous. It all fit. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, but I couldn't act on assumptions alone. I needed proof, something irrefutable that would expose whatever was happening behind those closed doors. That night, I drove home in silence, my mind racing. Elizabeth was already asleep by the time I got back. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching her. She looked peaceful, her face soft in the moonlight, but I couldn't shake the image of her slipping into that club, surrounded by secrets and lies. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at her, trying to reconcile the woman I knew with the person she seemed to be becoming. How much of what she told me was the truth? How much of our life together was real? I didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear. This wasn't the end of the road. It was just the beginning. The morning began with a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. There were no illusions left. Elizabeth was unfaithful. I had known it deep down for a while now, but knowing wasn't enough without solid proof. Confronting her with suspicions alone wouldn't work. She would deny, deflect, or even turn the tables on me. And if I was wrong, I couldn't afford that risk. I needed evidence, undeniable, concrete facts that would leave her with no room for lies. As I sat at the kitchen table nursing my coffee, I began to form a plan. I knew this would be the night I would finally uncover the truth. I reached out to Harry, an old acquaintance who worked as a lawyer. Harry wasn't just a lawyer. He had connections in places most people wouldn't dare to tread. After some convincing and a few favors promised in return, Harry managed to get me a temporary access card to the exclusive club Elizabeth had been visiting. It wasn't easy to obtain, and I could tell from his tone that he wasn't thrilled about helping, but he came through, and that was all that mattered. Tonight, I would walk through those doors and see for myself what was really going on. That evening, Elizabeth was getting ready again. She moved through the room with the same effortless grace she always had, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. Her dress was elegant, too revealing for a simple night out with friends. The scent of her perfume was intoxicating, expensive, too much for just another casual evening. I watched her from across the room, my face a mask of calm, even as my thoughts churned out with Jenna again tonight. I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Yes, it's a special evening for her. I couldn't say no. I nodded, keeping my emotions in check. Of course, have a good time. When she left, I waited a few minutes before grabbing my keys and following her. I knew where she was going. The club. It always came back to that place. When I arrived, I parked a few blocks away and approached on foot. The bouncer at the entrance gave me a once-over before I handed him the temporary card Harry had provided. He scanned it, nodded, and waved me in. As I stepped inside, I was hit by a wave of sensory overload. The air was heavy with the mingling scents of perfume and alcohol. Dim lighting created an intimate atmosphere, while soft pulsing music added to the aura. It wasn't like any club I'd ever been to. Everything about it screamed exclusivity, every detail designed to cater to the wealthy and the powerful. I moved through the crowd carefully, staying in the shadows, my eyes scanning the room for Elizabeth. It didn't take long to spot her. She was standing near the bar with Jenna, a champagne flute in her hand. Her other arm was draped casually around Jenna's shoulders. They were laughing, talking to a group of men who seemed far too comfortable in their proximity to my wife. One of them reached out, his hand grazing Elizabeth's shoulder. She didn't pull away. I felt a surge of rage, but forced it down. This wasn't the time to lose my composure. I needed evidence, not an outburst. I slipped my phone from my pocket and began taking photos. I captured Elizabeth with her champagne glass, her hand brushing against the arm of one of the men. The way she leaned in close as they spoke. Every angle, every detail, it was all there. frozen in time. Then came the moment that sealed everything. One of the men whispered something to her, and she laughed, tilting her head toward him in response. Moments later, she and the man slipped away from the group, disappearing into a private room. Jenna lingered near the entrance, positioning herself strategically as if to block anyone from seeing inside. My hand tightened around my phone as I snapped a final photo of the closed door. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the noise of the club fading into the background. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to confront her, to demand answers, to rip the facade apart right then and there. But I didn't. Emotion was the enemy now. I had what I came for. Proof. The photos were all I needed. Confrontation could wait. When I finally left the club, the cool night air hit me like a slap in the face. I walked back to my car, my mind racing but my expression blank. I had everything I needed, but the weight of what I had seen didn't lessen. If anything, it pressed harder on my chest with each step I took. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing. It was a message from my boss, a last-minute assignment requiring me to leave town for a week. Under normal circumstances, the timing would have been inconvenient, but now it felt like an opportunity. The space would give me time to process, to plan my next move. I packed my bag in silence, every action deliberate, every thought focused on what needed to happen next. As I descended the stairs with my suitcase in hand, Elizabeth appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a robe, her hair still damp from the shower, and she looked fresh, innocent even. The sight of her so serene, so unaffected, made my stomach churn. "You're leaving already? You didn't even tell me you were going," she said, her voice soft and affectionate, as if nothing was wrong. I met her eyes, forcing my expression to remain neutral. "Work," I said shortly. "I'll be back in a week." She stepped closer, leaning in to kiss me. "I'll miss you," she said softly, her voice warm and affectionate, as if nothing was wrong. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Her words felt like a mockery, a cruel joke laid over the lies and betrayal. I simply nodded, brushing past her without looking back. As I walked out the door, I felt a strange sense of finality. This wasn't just a business trip. This was the beginning of the end. I left knowing full well that when I returned, everything would change. There would be no more games, no more lies. This time, the truth would come out and our lives would never be the same. The hotel room was quiet, the soft hum of the air conditioner, the only sound as I sat at the small desk, my laptop open, numbers filling the screen as I attempted to focus on the reports that needed my attention. It was the second day of my business trip, and I wanted nothing more than to wrap up my work and return home. My life back then needed sorting out, but first I had to finish what I was here for. Then a notification pinged on my phone, breaking my concentration. I glanced at the screen, expecting something mundane, but what I saw made my stomach drop. It was an alert from my bank. A $2,000 charge had just gone through. The Merchant, a high-end adult store. For a moment I sat frozen, staring at the notification as if it might vanish or change if I blinked enough times. When it didn't, I opened the app to dig deeper. The details came through a moment later, along with a receipt email to my account. The list of items made my blood run cold. The centerpiece of the purchase was a box of 500 condoms. The rest included various oils, lubricants, and accessories that I couldn't even bring myself to fully process. She doesn't even care to hide it anymore, I thought. The anger bubbling inside me, my grip on the phone tightened as I stared at the screen. Green, the list of items mocking me with their brazen vulgarity. The sheer audacity of it all made me physically ill. My heart raced as a wave of fury crashed through me, but I forced myself to breathe, to think clearly. Losing control now wouldn't help. I needed to act. I spent the next hour meticulously planning my exit from the business trip. I couldn't stay here, not with this gnawing at my mind. I contacted my boss, explaining that I had urgent personal matters to handle and would need to cut my trip short. Convincing him wasn't easy, but I managed. By evening, I had booked a flight home. Then came the call from my neighbor, Tom. "Hey, John, I didn't mean to bother you," Tom started, his tone hesitant. "But something's going on at your house. There's a party, Lots of cars outside, music blasting. It's strange. I felt my throat tighten as I listened. "Can you see what's happening?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "Not really, the curtains are all drawn, but it's loud and it looks wild," he replied. "Try to get a video," I told him, my voice firm now. He agreed, but when he called back a few minutes later, he sounded defeated. "I tried, John," he said. "I walked around the house, but everything's shut tight. I can't see a thing." I hung up, tossing my phone onto the bed in frustration. The rage I had been holding back threatened to erupt, but I swallowed it down. Morning couldn't come fast enough. I spent the rest of the night arranging my early departure, and by sunrise I was on a plane heading home. When I arrived at my house around midday, the first thing I noticed was the front gate. It was slightly ajar, a detail that immediately set me on edge. As I approached, I saw strange marks on the front steps, smudges of something I didn't want to identify. The house was eerily silent now, a stark contrast to the chaos Tom had described the night before. Steeling myself, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The stench hit me first. Alcohol, sweat, perfume, all mingled into a nauseating cocktail. The floor was sticky underfoot, a slick film of some unknown substance coating the hardwood. Scattered across the furniture and carpets were used condoms, empty bottles, and crumpled napkins. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were suffused with the debauchery that had unfolded here. I moved through the house slowly, each step revealing more of the carnage. The living room was a disaster zone. Empty champagne bottles lay toppled on the floor, and the coffee table was littered with the remnants of what had once been food. At the center of it all, sprawled across the couch in a state of disheveled ruin, was Elizabeth. Her hair was a tangled mess, bits of debris clinging to it. Her skin glistened unnaturally slick with some kind of oil, and her clothing, or what little remained of it, was barely clinging to her body. Nearby, a bottle lay on its side, its contents pooling on the floor. I stood there staring at her, the weight of the moment crashing down on me. Slowly, I pulled out my phone and began recording. I captured everything: the filth, the chaos, the wreckage of what had once been our home. Each detail was preserved, each shot a damning piece of evidence. In the bathroom, I found empty bottles of oils and lubricants, further proof of the depravity that had taken place here. Returning to the living room, my gaze fell on a phone lying on the floor near Elizabeth. It wasn't hers. I picked it up, curiosity overcoming me. The lock screen was laughably easy to bypass, and within moments I found what I hadn't even known I was looking for: a folder of videos. As I opened it, the screen came alive with footage from the night before. The videos left no room for doubt. Elizabeth was front and center, surrounded by strangers in various states of undress. The laughter, the touches, the intimacy, it was all there, playing out in the vivid detail. One clip showed her in the middle of the room, her arms around two men, her laughter ringing out over the music. My hands shook as I transferred the files to my own phone. When the transfer was complete, I sent everything to my lawyer with a simple message: "Prepare the paperwork. It's over." By the time Elizabeth began to stir, I was standing over her, suitcase in hand. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, she looked confused. Then she saw the expression on my face, and her confusion turned to fear. "Get up," I said coldly, my voice devoid of emotion. "What are you doing?" she asked, sitting up slowly, still groggy. "You think I don't know?" I replied, my tone sharp, cutting. "You think you can lie your way out of this?" She started to say something, but I cut her off. "Enough. You had everything, Elizabeth, and this is what you chose. Get out of my house." I grabbed her things and dumped them unceremoniously on the porch. She tried to protest, to plead, but I didn't hear her. I didn't care. I closed the door behind her without another word, shutting out her voice, her presence, her betrayal. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. The storm had passed now. It was time to start over. Sitting on the couch in the now empty house, I couldn't escape the overwhelming sense of hollowness that filled the space. Elizabeth's suitcases still lay outside, untouched since I had thrown them out. She was gone. Hours had passed since I told her to leave, but her presence lingered in the mess she left behind. My lawyer was already working on the divorce papers, confident that the evidence I provided would make the process swift and decisive. But that wasn't enough for me. Closure wouldn't come just from ending the marriage. There were others who had a hand in this, people who had pulled Elizabeth into their twisted world, and I wasn't about to let them go unscathed. It all started with the phone. That phone I'd found at the scene of the party wasn't Elizabeth's. It belonged to one of the people who had been there. Whoever it was had been careless enough to leave it behind. Unlocking the device had been easy, and within minutes I had access to a treasure trove of information. Messages, photos, videos. It was all there. An unfiltered look into the depraved circle Elizabeth had fallen into. The first thing I uncovered was a string of messages between the phone's owner and Jenna. They were discussing upcoming parties, their tone casual and disturbingly matter-of-fact. One message from Jenna stood out. "Got another married one hooked on the games. She's a natural." It didn't take a genius to figure out she was talking about Elizabeth. My grip on the phone tightened as I read each word, fueling the anger boiling inside me. Further digging uncovered something even worse. Jenna wasn't just another participant in these events. She was an organizer. In another chat, she discussed her cut from clients who attended these parties, essentially pimping out women, including my wife, to wealthy men. Elizabeth had been nothing more than a pawn in Jenna's game, a tool she used to maintain her luxurious lifestyle. What truly enraged me, though, was the video I found stored in the cloud linked to the phone. It was footage of Jenna bragging about her ability to silence anyone who became a problem. "Money shuts people up," she said, smirking at the camera. "Everyone's got a price." Her arrogance was nauseating. And in that moment, I knew she wasn't just a catalyst in my wife's betrayal. She was the mastermind. The evidence I had gathered was damning, but I knew it wouldn't be enough to simply hand it over to my lawyer or the authorities. Jenna was clever, resourceful, and undoubtedly connected. If I wanted to bring her down, I needed to do more than just expose her. I needed to shake her confidence. I reached out to Jenna under the guise of wanting to talk. Surprisingly, she agreed to meet, likely out of curiosity about what I might know. We met at a quiet cafe, her demeanor as smug and self-assured as ever. She leaned back in her chair, a faint smirk playing on her lips. "Did you enjoy the show?" she quipped, her tone dripping with condescension. I didn't reply. Instead, I pulled out my phone and played the video of her boasting about her manipulation and profits. Her smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice sharp and defensive. "To make you disappear," I said, my tone calm but firm. "I have enough to bury you, Jenna. You're done." She tried to threaten me, her confidence wavering but not completely broken. I stood my ground, and for the first time, I saw cracks in her facade. She knew I wasn't bluffing, and that knowledge was enough to shake her. After the meeting with Jenna, I turned my attention to others involved in the circle. The phone provided a wealth of contacts, names, numbers, and even photos. Many of them were people with reputations to protect. Businessmen, lawyers, public figures. They had everything to lose, and I planned to ensure they lost it. One name stood out. Mark, a prominent businessman and a partner of the company I worked for. I found messages and call logs between him and Jenna, detailing their arrangements and payments. Armed with this information, I drafted an anonymous letter to Mark's wife, attaching screenshots of the messages. Within days, word spread that Mark had resigned, citing personal reasons. It wasn't hard to guess what had happened at home. Another name on the list was a local attorney, someone whose influence extended into the legal system. His messages revealed not only his involvement in the parties, but also evidence of bribery and blackmail. This time I went straight to the authorities. The police were more than eager to take the case, and within a week, news broke of his arrest. With each person I exposed, I felt a sense of justice. These weren't innocent bystanders. They were complicit in the web of lies and betrayal that had destroyed my marriage. And one by one, their lives were crumbling under the weight of their own actions. Finally, it was Jenna's turn. I compiled every piece of evidence I had against her. The videos, the messages, the financial transactions. I sent the package to multiple recipients, law enforcement, journalists, lawyers. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. Police opened an investigation into her activities, and the media seized on the story, eager to expose the scandal. Jenna's glamorous life began to unravel before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. This wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. Jenna had preyed on vulnerable people, exploited them for her own gain, and destroyed lives in the process. She deserved everything that was coming to her. I wasn't just fighting for myself, I was ensuring that no one else would fall victim to her schemes. By the time the divorce papers were finalized, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The house was quiet now, free of the chaos and deceit that had consumed it for so long. Elizabeth had gotten what she deserved, as had the people who had helped her tear our life apart. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to walk, unburdened by the lies and betrayal of the past. This time, I was certain I had done the right thing. The day of the court hearing was bleak and cold. I stood outside the courthouse, holding the case containing all the evidence I had meticulously gathered. This wasn't just a divorce proceeding for me. It was a battle I was determined to win. My lawyer Michael assured me that the evidence we had was more than enough to secure a favorable outcome, but I couldn't let myself relax. This was about more than just legalities. It was about reclaiming my life and restoring my dignity. Elizabeth arrived shortly after, her demeanor as infuriating as ever. She was dressed in an outfit that looked more suited for a night out than a courtroom, her confidence oozing as she strutted past me without a word. By her side was a young, inexperienced attorney who looked as if he had no idea how to handle the storm she would inevitably unleash. Watching her act so smug only fueled my resolve. When the hearing began, I let Michael take the lead. He was a consummate professional, laying out the evidence methodically. First came the photographs, then the videos, and finally financial records detailing her reckless spending. Each piece of evidence landed like a hammer blow, and I could see Elizabeth's confidence waver. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, whispering frantically to her lawyer as Michael continued. The turning point came when Michael presented the video from one of the parties. It showed Elizabeth front and center, laughing and engaging with multiple men in ways that left no room for interpretation. She snapped, jumping to her feet, screaming, "It's all lies! He can't stand that I'm happy without him." Her voice echoed through the courtroom, and the judge sternly called for order. But she was beyond control. Elizabeth's outburst escalated as she hurled insults and justifications. "I spent the money because I deserved it," she shouted. "I put up with his boring, predictable life for years." Her lawyer tugged at her arm, trying to calm her, but it was futile. The entire courtroom watched as she unraveled. When she finally sat down, the damage was done. I stood and addressed the judge, my voice steady. "Your Honor, I believe her words speak for themselves. She has admitted everything." Michael reinforced my point, highlighting how her behavior validated our case. Then I delivered the final blow. Financial records showing over $20,000 in frivolous expenditures, including the $2,000 adult store purchase. The judge took notes, his expression unreadable. Elizabeth erupted again, yelling about how she deserved the money and berating me for being cheap. The judge silenced her with a firm warning, his patience clearly wearing thin. The courtroom grew tense as he retired to deliberate. After hours of waiting, the judge returned with his decision. The court finds that Mrs. Walker has violated her marital obligations. All shared assets are awarded to the plaintiff, and the defendant is ordered to pay $20,000 in restitution for misused funds. The divorce is granted in favor of Mr. Walker. Elizabeth sat frozen, her face flushed with rage and humiliation, her lawyer leaning in, speaking in harsh tones, but it was clear there was nothing more he could do. I stood quietly, not gloating, but feeling the weight lift off my shoulders as I exited the courthouse. Elizabeth caught up to me, her face twisted with anger as she spat venomous words, calling me pathetic and accusing me of ruining her life. I stopped, looked her in the eyes, and said calmly, "I don't care what you think. I know you won't ruin my life anymore." Without waiting for her reply, I turned and walked away. I got into my car, shut the door, and exhaled deeply. For the first time in years, I felt unburdened. This chapter was over. For once, I felt free.